Hey everybody, it is late on Sunday night. I'm getting this lecture recorded for you guys so you have everything you need for the week. Just to give you a quick rundown, this is the final lecture of U.S. history. We're going to end with the civil rights movements that were taking place during this time period. I am sad, but also it's weird because I would obviously way prefer to do this in person. But I want to give you just a really quick rundown of what the next 2 weeks are going to look like. So you have this lecture to watch, and then you're going to choose one of the topics to create a presentation on, and you're going to share that with me. That is your final assignment for U.S. history, final official assignment. Then as soon as you finish that, you can submit your notes. You'll see there's an assignment for that as well. You're going to get a participation score. And then for anybody that is not passing my class currently, instead of doing a final for everybody, I have an assignment that is actually really pretty cool. You're creating you're creating a DBQ based on your time during this pandemic. You guys are technically a part of history, so that final assignment is optional. So if you are passing my class already and you have nothing to worry about, then don't do it. You're gonna get credit for it. You're good. If you are not, or you are on the verge, please, this is a must because it's gonna help your grade and hopefully get you to where you need to be. I understand that this is a difficult time, but I think the assignment is very doable and actually pretty cool. So that's it. I'm going to jump into the lecture. It's probably going to be like 20 minutes, but it's the last one, so enjoy it if possible. And that's it. Okay, so let's jump in to the presentation. Let me just pull this up. So we're going to be talking about the civil rights movements. And I know that it's weird because you usually just hear like the civil rights movement, but there are actually quite a few different civil rights movements that were happening during the Cold War, which, happens over the course of like 40 years. So anyway, these civil rights movements that were taking place, we're going to talk through three of them. We're going to be talking about the civil rights movement. We're going to be talking about El Movimiento, or the Chicano civil rights movement, and then we're going to be talking about the gay rights movement, all three of which were going on during a similar time period. So just to give you guys a real quick kind of rundown refresher, you guys will remember that the 14th Amendment was passed in 1868, which guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law, right? So every citizen should be equally protected by the law, right? This amendment becomes the groundwork for a lot of the pushes that were being made by African Americans, by Latinos, by and by people that were fighting for their rights during El Movimiento and the Civil Rights Movement, and then the same things that were being used and called for by people during the gay rights movement from the LGBTQ community. So this kind of like is the basis that we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to start with talking about the civil rights movement. So again, kind of a refresher. If you guys remember from last semester, we talked about Plessy versus Ferguson, where he sort of set the precedent for what Rosa Parks did, right? He refused to get up from the white section only of a seat because he was saying, well, that's not equal. I'm not being treated equally. And the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal does not violate the 14th Amendment. So they actually said that it's fine, you can have separate facilities. And you guys all know that led to very, the inequality in facilities, restrooms, theaters, I mean, you name it, was wild. And it was all okay, according to the Supreme Court, because of this ruling. So this becomes like what they try to fight against. The NAACP is founded in 1909, which was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was a team of lawyers that used the law, not just the 14th Amendment, but just tried to find laws and try to challenge laws that in a way to challenge segregation. So um, if you had an issue that you're facing, you could approach the NAACP to see if they would, um, kind of like take up your case in court. And they did for quite a few people. So this was sort of like a go-to that a lot of people, went for during this time period. But that was, I mean, it was very slow going, and there was a lot of losses, even though there were some victories. And so a lot of young people actually started to kind of take matters into their own hands. You guys might have heard of these before, but sit-ins were organized by younger people. It was a lot of young people that sort of were like the heart of these movements. It was the first sit-ins were in Chicago in 1942, which is like very, very early. I mean, we think of the civil rights movement as being like the 1950s to 1960s, kind of like, the Martin Luther King Jr., like that sort of thing. But the first sit-ins were actually in Chicago in 1942. They were organized by CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. It was a group that was fighting against segregation. And protesters sat at segregated lunch counters, and they refused to move until they were served. And the reason this is a big deal is because a lot of times they were either African Americans were either forbidden to enter the restaurant, or they had to pick up their food in the back. And so they're saying, like, this is ridiculous. Like, we are human beings. We should be able to sit here and eat our food. And so they would sit there, but they would sit there peacefully. Now, I want you guys to look at this photograph that was taken of a sit-in that happens later. Look in this picture. Who looks like they deserve to be sitting at a restaurant? I mean, these two women are sitting here quietly, peacefully, as food is being poured on them. This girl is getting a drink poured on her. I mean, you guys will see photographs. Do not remember those kindly who are taking away the rights of others and mistreating others. And this photograph says it all, right? These girls are not being served simply because of the color of their skin, where any of these people would have been served no problem. And look how uncivilized they are behaving. And so it's just interesting. And there's another example that I'm going to show you. So what is largely considered sort of like, there's a couple sort of catalysts of like, the more sort of like the civil rights movement that we know of. And there are a couple different events. One is Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court case. The Supreme Court unanimously strikes down the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling that I just was kind of reminding you guys of. Mind you, this has been over 50 years where segregation has been the law of the land. But the Supreme Court unanimously strikes down separate but equal in schools, right? So this is, but still a step in the right direction. So school segregation is banned by the Supreme Court, except for the Supreme Court says in their ruling that schools should desegregate with all deliberate speed. So it's a little bit vague, and there are a lot of schools that deliberately said, oh yeah, sure, we will desegregate, we will get around to it. And so they don't really like do anything about it immediately. Some do, and you start to see some desegregation going on in the South, where a lot of the segregation was, but it's not the only area. I mean, you guys know that there's schools all over the United States that were segregated and then had to move away from that because of this ruling. So this court ruling kind of like sparks a lot of attention, a lot of action. You start to see, schools desegregating, again, youth being involved. But probably the biggest thing, the biggest catalyst for the youth was the murder of Emmett Till. So the next year, after this Supreme Court ruling, a 14-year-old boy, Emmett Till, went down to go visit his uncle who lived in the South. Emmett Till lived in the North. Not that anybody, I mean, everybody knew like the segregation that was going on, but he wasn't maybe like as accustomed to just how terrible things were in the South at this point in time. He goes down to visit his uncle, and he goes into a shop, and supposedly, when he goes into the shop, and there are varying accounts that he whistled, winked, or said "Hey baby" to a white woman that was in the shop. That white woman, her husband Roy, actually owned the shop. And so Emmett goes on his way. He goes home, and that night, he is ripped from his home, and he was brutally attacked. He was beaten. He was whipped. He was hung. He was shot through the head, and then kind of like the final thing that they did is they actually, with barbed wire, tied a cotton gin to him and sunk him in the river. And like when you think about the symbolism of like them tying a cotton gin to him, it's just a symbol of slavery, and sort of like these men that attacked him asserting that like this is where he should be. So his body is found, and he so everyone finds out about this. They go to court. So I'm going to show you guys a photograph. Just like fast forward me if you don't want to see it. But Emmett Till's mom specifically requested that they have an open casket, because she was like, I do not want to hide what happened to my son. Regardless if he said "Hey baby," if he winked or whatever. Obviously he did not deserve what happened, but she specifically said she wanted an open casket because she's like, I need everybody to see what happened to him and what's going on, the truth of what's happening in the South. So here's a photograph from his funeral. You guys can see here he is on the left, and then here's a photograph of him in his open casket. It's absolutely horrible. And just, I want to show you guys this photograph as well. This is Roy Brown, and the man that they accused of murdering Emmett Till. This is Roy's wife, the one that Emmett Till supposedly whistled at or winked at. And this is them the day their court case came to an end. When the verdict was read, he was let off. They were both let off completely free. You guys can see they're laughing, kind of not a care in the world. This is what the realities of the African American community were facing. So this really sparks the energy of the young people, and they really become like the heart and core of the civil rights movement. So the Montgomery bus boycott, you guys have probably heard of. If we were in class, we would have done an activity on like, why was the Montgomery bus boycott successful? The Montgomery bus boycott began when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. So a couple of reasons. Number one, there were all these advocacy groups that kind of like helped pave the way for a lot of these decisions and actions to be taken. There was, if you guys can see here, like concentrated efforts by the African American community they did like ride sharing, carpooling, they walked miles and miles and miles to work. So they were really the ones that were taking public transportation And so when they boycotted it and refused to get on to the public transportation, it really, really, really damaged the business. And then a lot of the people that came down, they were actually trained at Highlander School. Martin Luther King Jr. spent some time here. It was like a school that literally, I mean, there was white, I mean, there's people of all colors at this school that were all wanting to stand up for civil rights for people. And so this school actually trained a lot of the leaders of the civil rights movement. They coached the young people. If anyone does research on the Freedom Summer, they actually coached the youth. They like would, train them on like kind of what they could expect when they went down south. They trained some of the freedom riders. So a lot of the reason this Montgomery bus boycott was successful is you had leaders that came from Highlander School that kind of like, including Rosa Parks. She spent time at Highlander School, kind of coaching them on what they were going to face and kind of like showing them what unity can really look like. So that's just some kind of cool information about the Montgomery bus boycott. And then another event I wanted to talk about was, you guys remember Brown versus Board of Education said that schools had to be desegregated. So in Arkansas, Governor Orville Faubus, he actually refused to desegregate his schools, and he actually sent the National Guard, and he himself stood in front of his school to turn away the 9 African American students. This is Minnie Jean Brown that you guys can see here. If we were in class, we would have done a whole activity kind of learning about her. She's an incredible young woman, but literally to prevent these students from making it into the high school. Can you guys imagine? I mean, literally, like the governor calls up the National Guard to bar students from entering a school simply because of the color of their skin. Remember when I showed you guys the pictures of the sit-ins and I said history does not remember people well that are trying to, I mean, this woman is on the wrong side of history is what I mean. If you see this photograph, this is a teenage girl who is just trying to go get her education, and this white woman here in the back is screaming at her like she is, I mean, the worst enemy in the world. I mean, like, you can see the hatred on their faces, and history doesn't remember them well, and here she was just trying to make it to school. So they actually end up having to send in, President Eisenhower actually sends in troops to escort these students to school. And that does not mean that the road was easy, because once they were in school, there was a lot that they had to have to face. And that's what I mean when I'm saying in class, we would have looked at what life was like in school for them. If you're interested in looking at this, you guys can do it for your project at the end. Okay, these are just some of the foundational moments of the civil rights movement. There are so many more, and you guys are going to get an opportunity to look into one of them when you do your project. But I'm going to move on to talk about Movimiento, which the Chicano civil rights movement. So I'm going to just give you guys a few kind of like tidbits of information, and I want you, if you're interested, to kind of dive into that in the project that you do, if you choose one of these. But I want to talk to you guys about a couple people. This guy here, Corky Gonzalez, Rodolfo Gonzalez, he was a kind of critical leader of the Chicano civil rights movement. He really inspired the youth. That was sort of like a big focus of his. He founded some different organizations, but a couple things that he did is he actually kind of like embraced the word Chicano. So Chicano becomes this kind of like new way, this sort of word that Latinos were claiming for themselves, as opposed to being called Hispanic, or as opposed to being called, you know, Mexican American, or like dashes, in your name. Instead, kind of like embraces this new word Chicano and kind of really talks to like what does that mean. He was huge on kind of looking at and taking pride in your heritage, like where you came from, um, the struggle of that, but then also like where you were in the moment. He wrote a poem, which if we were in class, we would have spent time. It's an amazing poem. It's called I Am Joaquin. And this is actually a really famous poem that a lot of the youth really grab onto, that really captures the struggle of like, I'm both, I'm like the conqueror and the conquered. I'm like from, you know, I'm from these roots, but I also have roots here, and I'm sort of in this in between. And he really like speaks to this sort of like pull that Chicano youth really felt, between, embracing life in America, but also like staying connected to your roots. And so he actually also like really is a supporter of this idea Atzlan, which is sort of like this homeland for Chicanos. It's not like they were saying they should take over or take back a part of the United States. It was more like, this is where a lot of us are concentrated, so this should be like our kind of like claimed homeland, if that makes sense. Some people really saw it as threatening, and we'll talk about that in a second. But and then obviously Cesar Chavez, you guys have um, heard of before, the founder of the United Farm Workers. United Farm Workers, meaning he actually worked with Filipinos who were also kind of like facing similar struggles, and they formed the United Farm Workers. But the strategy was to help the migrant farm workers, help farm workers that were just like subject to racism, very low pay, and trying to organize them so they could stand up for themselves. So they used all sorts of strategies. They had strikes, boycotts, fasting, art, these like amazing murals, prayer. All of it was nonviolent. So Cesar Chavez actually worked really closely with Martin Luther King Jr. In really like kind of advocating for this nonviolent resistance. And the Delano grape strike is actually like one of the very successful strikes that they end up having. That's an option for one of the research projects if you're interested in doing that. But Cesar Chavez was instrumental in kind of organizing that strike. And then La Raza Unida was like this political party that was formed during this Chicano movement, and they were fighting for political power. And I've told you guys over and over again this year that a lot of times people really realize that you can't actually make change unless you have like political representation. And so that's what La Raza Unida was all about, was getting that political power. So they were trying to get Chicanos elected to office so that they could actually make change. Here you guys can see this is actually the map of kind of Aztlan. If you notice, it's a lot of the area that the United States actually took from Mexico in their years. But they wanted to make change, and one of the issues that they faced was gerrymandering. You're going to probably talk about this more in government next year, but gerrymandering, literally, they would, people in power would literally redraw. We'd spend more time on this. I'm trying to like explain it quickly, but they would redraw the boundaries of like an area to divide up the Latinos in the area so that they couldn't all vote together as one. So they would be like broken up into like 5 different sections, and so it would specifically draw the lines in that way. So that was just one of the things that they were like kind of up against, but they really wanted to kind of get people in office. So if anything from there sounds interesting, you guys can jump on that for the project. And then now I'm going to jump into the gay rights movement, which was again going on kind of like during a similar time period. So just to give you guys some information on what it was like for people that were a part of this movement, or before the movement even took off. I'm going to use New York as an example. New York had laws that said it was criminal to solicit homosexual relations. So if you were trying to solicit homosexual relations, you could be sent to jail. You could also be arrested and sent to jail for not wearing gender specific clothing. So this was a target, obviously, to the LGBTQ community. Another reason you could be arrested. And then the third reason you could be arrested is they actually made it a law that a gathering of homosexuals was considered disorderly conduct. So if you were a group of people that got together, you could that gathering in and of itself could be considered disorderly conduct. So just I put it kind of under here. All of these laws really made the LGBTQ community come together, but it all had to sort of be underground. You had these clubs and these bars that become a refuge for the gay community, where they could go and they could freely express themselves and be who they were without kind of shame or fear of being arrested. However, this becomes an issue because the mafia actually controlled a lot of these bars and underground kind of areas that the LGBT community used. So there were a lot of issues. I mean, this is all having to be in hiding, so the conditions, a lot of them were really, really, really bad in these bars. The mafia sometimes, like, they're a money-making organization, so would, charge crazy high prices. There was some, like, bribery, extortions if certain people who were trying to stay, like keep their identity sort of under wraps, but were coming to these bars. So there was some issues with that. But this really still, there you saw this really vibrant community develop because it was kind of like a refuge. So even though there were issues there, it really does become a refuge for the community. So this kind of like comes to a head in June 1969. The police actually raided the Stonewall Inn. This was a mafia run inn. Some people say that the mafia tipped the police off. Some people say that they knew but didn't tell the people. So, I mean, there's all sorts of sort of theories about what happened. But it was a gay club. The police raided it. And in the raid, you guys can see here some like photographs of the raid. It sparked a 6-day riot in the street. So there's a lot of people from the neighborhood and neighboring areas that came out and really like spoke in favor of the LGBT community and their rights to be able to gather and be together. Marsha P. Johnson, you guys can see here, she was a trans woman who becomes sort of like this figurehead. She already was. She was very like well known in the community, but it's kind of controversial on her involvement in the Stonewall riot. Some people say, she threw a brick at a, police car. Some people said, she was the one who kind of like really launched the riots. Other people say she just came later but really becomes a spokesperson. But she really becomes this like kind of figure for the gay rights movement. So this is sort of like this launching point, the Stonewall riots, towards just more openness and awareness of the oppression that the LGBTQ community was facing, so this is sort of like a step in sort of like making some changes. But obviously, you guys know this is 1969, right? And things continue to be difficult for that community. And so this is sort of like seen as like that sort of foundational movement. So if there's anything from this that interests you, then I would love for you guys to dive more into it in your presentation, or not presentation, I guess you're just going to create a PowerPoint or Google Slides. So here are the requirements. I have a template for you guys that you guys can click on. And that's officially it, you guys. So I miss you all, and have a great summer that is hopefully out and about. Hopefully things get better. Okay.